The rose petals stretched from my doorstep into the woods, too perfectly placed to be an off-eder accident. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Halfway in, a note was nailed to a tree. Follow the rules or don't come back. My breath caught as I noticed the footprints around me too large, too deep, and closing in. I've never been the kind of person to believe in ghost stories. Urban legends, horror movies, whispers of cursed places were just entertainment to me. I always thought fear was something the mind created, something that only had power if you let it. But fear is real, and I know that now. I live alone, in a house at the edge of a dense forest. I like the isolation, the quiet. No neighbors, no traffic, just nature. I work from home, so I don't have to go into town often, and honestly, that's the way I like it. No distractions. But tonight, as I stood on my front porch, staring at the rose petals leading into the woods, I realized something I had never considered before. Maybe isolation isn't always a good thing. The petals stretched out in a perfect line, vibrant against the frost-covered ground. They started right at my doorstep, as if someone had carefully placed them there just for me. A Valentine's prank? Maybe. But that didn't make sense. I hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. No visitors. No friends dropping by. And yet, the petals looked fresh, not scattered by the wind, not crushed underfoot. They led into the darkness, between the trees, disappearing into the black void of the forest beyond. Something about it made my skin prickle. And then I saw the note. It was nailed to a tree just beyond the tree line, slightly curled, fluttering despite the still air. I hesitated. Then slowly, I stepped forward. The cold bit into my skin as I reached out, peeling the paper from the bark with stiff fingers. Ink was smudged, but the message was clear. Follow the rules or don't come back. My stomach twisted. What rules? I turned back toward my house. The porch light was still on, glowing warmly in the distance, but somehow it felt far away. Something inside me told me to turn around, go back inside, lock the door. Instead, I took another step forward. The deeper I walked, the quieter the world became. At first, I didn't notice, but after a few minutes, the absence of sound became suffocating. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, not even the distant hum of wind through the trees. The silence felt alive, pressing against my skin like something was watching. I swallowed hard. The rose petals beneath my feet still looked fresh, unnaturally so, despite the cold. The scent of roses hung in the air, thick and cloying, too strong. It was starting to make me feel lightheaded. Then I saw another note. It was wedged between two twisted branches, as if someone had carefully placed it there just for me to find. I pulled it free, my pulse hammering as I read the words. You're already breaking the first rule. My breath caught. What first rule? I spun around, suddenly desperate to see where I had come from. But the trail of petals behind me was gone. My chest tightened. That wasn't possible. The petals had been there. I had been following them. Now, there was only untouched forest behind me. No sign of the path I had walked. I took a step back, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. A wave of dread crawled up my spine, slow and suffocating. Then, I saw them. The footprints. Not mine. Too large, too deep. They weren't leading away from me. They were circling. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I wasn't alone. I turned sharply, my breath coming too fast, fogging in the frigid air. My eyes darted across the trees, searching for movement. But there was nothing, just the darkness pressing in. My fingers curled into fists. I needed to get out of here. I turned back toward the path, and that's when I saw another note. It was nailed to a tree just ahead. It hadn't been there seconds ago. The paper trembled slightly, though there was still no wind. I didn't want to touch it, but I had to. My hands shook as I pulled it free, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it was rattling inside. My chest. If you see the figure, don't run. My mouth went dry. The figure? Slowly, stiffly. I turned my head. At first I thought it was just another tree, just another shadow among the dark. But then it moved. Tall. Too tall. Limbs that bent the wrong way. A head tilted too far. It stood still, watching, waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then I remembered the note. If you see the figure, don't run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and bolt, but I couldn't. My body was locked in place, muscles burning with the effort to stay completely still. The figure didn't move. I only watched it, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. My lungs ached from holding my breath. Then, slowly, the thing took a step forward. The petals beneath my feet had turned black now, curling inward, rotting. The scent of roses was gone, replaced with something sharp and metallic. A note fluttered to the ground in front of me. I didn't see where it came from. I didn't want to know. With shaking hands, I picked it up, unfolding it with stiff fingers. The ink was smeared. You've already broken the first rule. There's no leaving now. A cold breath brushed against my ear. The forest exhaled. The figure took another step toward me, and the petals beneath me began to move. The figure stood too still. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears I swore it would hear me. Its body was twisted, wrong, with long, unnatural limbs, and a head that tilted too far to one side. It didn't have eyes, at least. None that I could see, but I knew it was watching me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But the note in my trembling hands had been clear. If you see the figure, don't run. I forced myself to stay still, muscles burning with tension. My breath came in short, uneven gasps, fogging in the cold night air. The forest felt alive now. The trees are no longer just trees, but looming, breathing things, pressing in on me, their shadows twisting and stretching in ways they shouldn't. The petals beneath me had withered to black, curling and writhing like something was shifting beneath them. Then, the figure moved again. Not a normal movementous snap. A jolt, like a marionette being yanked by invisible strings. It took another step forward. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I had no idea what would happen if I moved. If I broke the rule, I didn't want to find out. I focused on my breathing, willing my body to remain frozen. My legs ached to bolt, but I stood my ground, every muscle tight as a coiled spring. The figure stopped just a few feet from me, close enough that I could hear it. Not breathing, not growling, clicking, a slow, deliberate clicking sound, like bones snapping into place. The scent of rot curled in my nostrils. Then, right behind me, a voice whispered, "You weren't supposed to see this." I broke. Instinct overruled everything. The terror, the warning, the note, clutched in my frozen fingers. None of it mattered anymore. I turned and ran. Branches lashed at my arms as I tore through the trees, my breath ragged, my chest burning. The forest wasn't the same anymore. The path that had been there minutes ago was gone. The trees shifted as I ran, twisting and closing in, their shapes warping in my peripheral vision. The ground beneath me felt unstable, soft, too soft, like I was running across something alive. Behind me, I heard it move. Not footsteps. Something else. Something faster. A dragging, scraping sound, followed by a horrific snap like bones breaking in reverse. My legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. Then, ahead of me, another note nailed to a tree. I barely had time to snatch it as I ran past. I didn't stop running until I saw the words. If you're running, it means you've already lost. My heart stopped. I slowed, my lungs heaving, a sharp pain stabbing at my ribs. Lost. I was lost. I spun in a circle, searching the darkness for any sign of the trail, for the glowing safety of my safety. Porch light in the distance. Nothing. The trees loomed taller now, their trunks gnarled and unnatural. The sky above wasn't the same. The moon was gone, the stars swallowed by something vast and black. The forest wasn't the forest anymore. Something had changed. And the figure wasn't behind me anymore. The silence returned, heavier than before. No wind, no rustling branches, only the distant sound of breathing. But it wasn't my breathing. It was coming from above me. Slowly, dreading what I already knew, I lifted my gaze. It was in the trees, hunched among the tangled branches, its limbs bent in the wrong directions. Its head cocked, twitching as if it had just realized I could see it. It didn't have a face, but it was smiling. And then, from somewhere impossibly close, came the voice again. "You should have followed the rules." I stumbled backward, heart pounding, brain screaming at me to run, but where? I was trapped. That's when I heard it. A fluttering sound. Soft. Just behind me. Another note. I turned, hands shaking as I reached down to pick it up. I almost didn't want to read it, but I had no choice. The words were different this time, hurried. Desperate. You were never supposed to follow the petals. That wasn't part of the game. You let it see you. You let it break the rules. Now it doesn't have to play fair anymore. The moment I finished reading, something grabbed my wrist. I didn't have time to scream. The world twisted, tilting in a way that made my stomach lurch, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in the forest anymore. I was somewhere else. The trees had changed, stretching into impossible shapes, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against a sky that wasn't a sky at all. The stars were eyes, watching, waiting. The figure was no longer perched in the trees. It was right in front of me. It didn't move like a living thing. It jerked forward, the sound of snapping tendons filling the air as it stretched itself taller, its body contorting as it closed the distance. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The forest wasn't a forest. It was a cage, and I had walked straight into it. Another note fluttered to the ground. I didn't reach for it this time, because I already knew what it would say. You've already broken the first rule. There's no leaving now. I opened my mouth to scream, and the world went black. When I woke up, I was on my front porch. The sun was rising, casting long golden rays across the trees. The forest looked normal. Again, like nothing had ever happened. I sat up, my head spinning, my breath ragged. My hands were covered in dirt, my clothes torn, my body aching like I had been running for hours. Has it been a dream? Had I imagined all of it? Then I saw the note, crumpled in my fist, the ink smudged but still legible. You broke the first rule. It let you go this time. But next time, it won't. I turned toward the woods. The rose petals were gone. But the trees, they were still watching, waiting. I went inside and locked the door. But I knew it didn't matter. I had followed the petals. And now, the game has already begun. I locked the door. I locked every door. Then I checked the windows twice. The early morning light bled through the curtains, painting soft golden streaks across the floor, but it did nothing to calm me. My hands were still shaking, my pulse still hammering against my ribs. I could still smell the roses. That sickly sweet scent clung to my clothes, to my skin, buried in my lungs like I had breathed in something rotten. I sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the crumpled note, still clutched in my brick hand. You broke the first rule. It let you go this time. But next time, it won't. My stomach twisted. I didn't understand. I didn't know what I had done wrong. Had it been following the petals? Seeing the figure? Running when I shouldn't have? I had no answer. Only the heavy weight of knowing that whatever had happened last night, it wasn't over. I needed to stay inside. I needed to act like none of it had happened. That's what I told myself. But deep down I knew better. Because when I finally forced myself to stand and look outside, there were footprints in the snow, circling my house. The prints weren't mine. They were too big, too deep, stretching around my house, in an eerie, perfect loop. My mouth went dry. I hadn't heard anything during the night. No footsteps, no doors creaking open, no breathing. And yet, something had been here, watching. I swallowed hard, my pulse a sharp throb in my ears. Maybe they were old. Maybe I had just missed them before. I forced myself to believe that, because the alternative meant that whatever had been in those woods wasn't finished with me. I grabbed my phone, hands still trembling, as I pulled up my call list. My fingers hovered over the only person I could think to call, Mark. We hadn't talked in months. Not since he moved out of town. But he'd believed in this kind of stuff. Ghost stories, folklore, rules. He had always told me, you don't break the rules in places older than you. I had laughed at him back then. Now, I wasn't laughing. I hit a call. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. Voicemail. I clenched my jaw, closing my eyes. Maybe it was better this way. What was I even going to tell? Him? Hey, I followed a trail of rose petals into the woods last night, and now something's circling my house. Do you know what happens when you break the rules? Yeah, that would go over well. I let out a slow breath. Maybe this would all blow over. Maybe I was imagining things. I just needed to act normal. Go about my day. Ignore the footprints. Ignore the growing feeling that I was being watched. By midday, I'd almost convinced myself I had overreacted. The footprints were still there, but they hadn't moved. The house was still silent. Maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. But then I checked the back door, and there was a note taped to the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't mine. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't heard anyone put it there. With shaking hands, I peeled it off the door, fingers stiff as I unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as before, but this time, the words were different. Don't look outside after dark. My skin prickled. The air felt heavier. The feeling of being watched pressed against my skull like a weight, suffocating. I forced myself to move, to lock the back door, to draw every curtain in the house. I wasn't going to look. I wasn't going to break another rule. Not again. Night came too fast. The day had bled away, leaving only shadows stretching long across my floor. I sat in my living room, every curtain drawn, every door locked, trying to ignore the suffocating silence outside. But the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It felt full, like something was waiting, like something was listening, and then I heard it. The first step, a slow, deliberate crunch in the snow. My breath caught. Then, another step, and another, closer. I clenched my hands into fists, pressing my back against the couch. It was right outside. Moving around my house. The footsteps were slow, measured, not wandering, not lost. They were circling. I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't look outside. I gritted my teeth, gripping my arms so hard my nails dug into my skin. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept going, circling, over and over. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, they stopped. Right outside the window, right behind the curtain. I could feel it. Standing there, watching, waiting. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my chest. I didn't move. I didn't dare. And then, a note slid under the door. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to read it. But I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I reached for the note, my fingers brushing against the rough paper. I turned it over, heart thudding violently in my chest. 4 words. You're not alone anymore. The air left my lungs. I whipped my head up, staring at the door. The footsteps hadn't moved. But something felt different. The air was colder. The silence was too deep. And then, a soft knock. My heart nearly stopped. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a soft, almost polite knock against the wood. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, from outside, a voice. Familiar. Let me in. I stiffened. The voice, it sounded like me. Knock, knock. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it wasn't right. I sat frozen on the floor, my hands clenched into fists, my breath shallow and uneven. Then, from the other side of the dormion voice, let me in. My skin prickled with cold. It wasn't me. It sounded like me. The same tone, the same cadence. But there was something off, just slightly wrong, too controlled, too hollow. My chest tightened, my stomach twisting into knots. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I didn't, because deep down, I knew something important. If I responded, if I made a sound, it would know exactly where I was. And then, it wouldn't have to ask to come inside. The knock came again. Knock, knock, then silence. My fingers gripped the floorboards, my body aching from how still I had been sitting. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Then, the footsteps started again. Not walking away, circling. That awful rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow returned, moving around my house in perfect loops. They were slower this time, almost thoughtful, lingering, like whatever was out there wasn't just walking. I was looking for something. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to drown out the sound, but it didn't help. Because then, the whispering started. From outside, from the walls, from the ceiling. You shouldn't have followed the petals. You shouldn't have broken the rule. It's too late to leave now. I squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't matter, because then, I saw the note. It slid under the door slowly, like something on the other side was taking its time. The paper scraped against the wooden floor, curling at the edges. I didn't want to read it, but I had no choice. I reached out with stiff fingers, unfolding the crumpled paper. And there it was. Turn around. Keep walking. Don't stop. My throat tightened. Turn around? Keep walking? I stared at the words, my breath shallow. A shiver crawled up my spine, and for the first time, I realized something. The house felt wrong. I had been so focused on the noises outside that I hadn't noticed it before. But now, the air inside felt heavy, like I wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, my gaze flickered toward the dark hallway leading toward my bedroom, and my stomach dropped. The hallway was longer than before. That hallway had always been short, just a few steps between my living room and bedroom. But now, it stretched too far, too deep. The walls looked warped, like they had been stretched and twisted into something unnatural. And at the very end of that impossible hallway, there was a door that shouldn't be there, a door I had never seen before. The note crumpled in my hand. Turn around, keep walking, don't stop. My hands trembled. I didn't want to move, but something in my gut told me that if I stayed here much longer, the door would open on its own. So I stood up. I turned my back to the hallway, and I walked. I moved slowly, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. I didn't know where I was going. The note hadn't told me where to go, just to keep walking. But the moment I stepped forward, something shifted. The walls groaned, the air thickened, and then I heard it. A new sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Long, slow, deliberate breathing. Right behind me. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to look. But I didn't. I kept walking, and that's when I realized I wasn't in my house anymore. I stepped forward, and the floor beneath me changed. No more wooden panels. Dirt. Cold, damp dirt. The air smelled different now. The thick scent of earth, pine, and something else rotten. I stopped. Slowly, hesitantly, I lifted my head, and my stomach plummeted. I was in the woods again, but not the same woods. Everything looked wrong. The trees were taller, their branches tangled together like skeletal fingers. The sky was black, not like nighttime, but like there was nothing there at all. And the rose petals, they were back, leading into the darkness. I turned. My house was gone. There was no sign of it. No doors, no windows. Just the trees, just the trail of petals. And then, from the darkness, a voice. Not a whisper this time. A voice. And it was mine. You should have stayed inside. The woods weren't the same. I could feel it, like the trees were breathing, their branches curling, twisting, closing in around me. The air was too thick, too still, pressing against my skin like something alive. And the worst part, I wasn't alone. I could hear my own voice somewhere in the darkness. You should have stayed inside. It came from deep in the trees, shifting, moving, circling me. My hands clenched into fists. My pulse pounded in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that matched the sharp, creeping panic rising in my chest. I didn't know where to go. The house was gone. There was no way back. But the petals, the trail of rose petals was still there, leading forward. I had no choice. I followed them. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ground beneath me wasn't normal, not solid, not real. It shifted under my feet, too soft, like something was moving just beneath the surface. And the petals, they were changing. At first, they had been a perfect, deep red, fresh, vibrant, almost beautiful. But the further I walked, the darker they became. Not withered, not dried, soaked, like they had been dipped in something thick, something warm, something wet. I didn't want to think about it. I forced myself to keep moving, not looking too closely, not letting the thought of what might be staining those petals settle in my mind. But then, the petals moved. I saw it. A single rose petal, shifting, twitching, curling inward like something breathing. I stopped walking. I wasn't imagining it. The petals weren't just lying on the ground. They were pulsing. A cold dread wrapped around my spine. The petals continued to move, twitching in slow, unnatural motions, curling like fingers. The deeper I walked, the worse it got. Some petals were lifting from the ground, floating up like they were caught in an invisible current, but there was no wind. They hovered in the air, trembling, watching. I took a slow step forward, my breath shallow, my heart hammering so hard, it felt like my ribs would crack. Then, a whisper, right beside my ear, soft, close. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice was right next to me. Do you know what they are? My hands shook. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw it. The petals weren't petals anymore. They were eyes, everywhere, thousands of them. The petals had changed, twisting and morphing into small, unblinking eyes staring, shifting, rolling in all directions. They covered the trees, the ground, the air. Each tiny bloodshot eye locked onto me, watching my every movement. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My body screamed at me to run, but something deep inside me whispered not to. I couldn't look away. If I moved too fast, if I looked away for even a second, they would blink, and I didn't want to know what happened when they blinked. Another note appeared. It wasn't nailed to a tree this time. It rose from the ground, floating gently through the air before stopping right in front of me, like it had been waiting for me to take it. I hesitated. Then, slowly, I reached out, my fingers closing around the paper. I unfolded it. The ink was wet, and the message was short. Don't let them blink. I inhaled sharply, my hands tightening around the note. I was right. I couldn't look away. I had to keep my eyes wide open, because the second they blinked, something would happen. Something worse. I felt it before I saw it. A ripple in the air. A shift in the atmosphere. And then, from somewhere deep in the trees, a single, wet, unmistakable sound. A blink. I clenched my jaw, my pulse hammering so violently I thought I would pass out. One of them had closed its eye, and when it opened again, something was different. The forest had changed. The trees weren't just trees anymore. Their bark twisted, bulging, shifting like flesh. Long skeletal arms stretched from the branches, curling toward me, reaching. The ground twitched beneath my feet, pulsing with something alive. The air shook. The eyes were blinking now, one by one, slowly, rhythmically, like something was waking up. I had seconds. I had to get out. I had to move. My body finally listened. I ran. I didn't care if I was breaking a rule. I didn't care what waited ahead. I had to get away from this place. The whispering voices grew louder. They followed me, not just from behind, from above, from below, from inside my own head. Don't stop. Keep moving. If you stop, you'll wake it up completely. The trees were closing in. The path was disappearing. And then, I saw it. A doorway, standing alone in the forest. Tall, wooden, leading to somewhere else. I had no choice. I ran toward it. The ground shifted violently, buckling beneath me. Something was rising from below. I threw myself toward the door, my fingers grazing the handle just as the forest let out a deep, groaning breath. And then, I pulled the door open, and everything went white. The door swallowed me whole. One moment, I was sprinting through the nightmare forest, the ground shifting beneath my feet, the eyes blinking awake. The next, I was falling. Not down, not up, just falling. I couldn't feel my body, couldn't hear my breath, couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. The light around me wasn't white anymore. It had turned deep red, thick, suffocating, like the petals that had led me into this trap. My stomach lurched. My mind screamed. I reached out grasping for anything, any surface, any edge, and then I hit the ground. I gasped as my body slammed onto something soft. Not dirt, not wood, petals. I was lying on them. The scent was unbearable, thick and cloying, clinging to my lungs, my skin, my clothes. I coughed, pushing myself up with trembling arms, my fingers sinking into the petals. They felt warm, sticky, like they had been plucked from something still alive. I forced myself to look around. I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was somewhere else. The space around me was dark, endless, stretching in every direction. A thick, misty fog rolled over the petals, swirling with every shaky breath I took. And in front of me, in the center of this nightmare, A box. Small, red, perfectly wrapped. A gift. My heartbeat stuttered. It sat there, completely still, like it had been waiting for me. And then, as I watched, a single note appeared beside it. I swallowed hard. The note was folded neatly, too neatly, as if whoever had placed it there had done so carefully, purposefully. I reached for it with shaking fingers, hesitating before unfolding it. The handwriting was the same as before. Neat. Precise. Open it. It's for you. A shudder crawled down my spine. Number. No, I wasn't stupid. This was a trick. A trap. I wasn't about to open some gift from the thing that brought me here. I crumpled the note in my fist. But the second I did, the box shifted. Not a lot. Just a tiny, barely there twitch. Like it had felt my rejection. Like it had noticed. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I took a slow step back. The box didn't move again, but the petals around it did. They stirred, rippling like something underneath them had just shifted. I wasn't alone here. Something was waiting, watching. I clenched my jaw. If I ran, would it chase me? If I refused the gift, would it punish me? The air felt thicker now, pressing against my lungs like an unseen hand. And then, from the darkness beyond, I heard the voice again. It's rude to refuse a gift. I didn't respond. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to wake up, to move, to do anything but stand there like a fool. But my body wouldn't listen, because deep down I knew. I had no choice. I had to open it. The box knew it. The voice knew it. And now, so did I. With slow, shaking fingers, I reached down. I didn't want to. I didn't want to touch it. But I did. My fingers brushed against the velvet ribbon. And the second I did, the box opened on its own. I flinched back, expecting something to jump out. Something alive. Something with teeth. But nothing happened. The lid flipped open silently, revealing a mirror. Small, handheld. Its surface was cracked, fogged over, like it had been sitting in this place for years. That was it. No monster. No hands reaching out to drag me into the abyss. Just a mirror. I let out a slow, shaky breath. Then, hesitantly, I picked it up. The second I did, the world lurched. The petals shriveled to black. The mist rolled back. And behind me, reflected in the broken glass, was something that wasn't me. I went cold. My reflection stood there. But it was wrong. Its eyes were missing. Just empty, gaping holes where they should have been. And its mouth was smiling. But I wasn't. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't even breathing. My grip tightened around the mirror. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I tore my gaze away, looking down at the petals at my feet. And when I glanced back at the mirror, my reflection was closer. Not subtly, not slowly. It had jumped forward, so that now it filled the glass completely. That horrible stretched grin, those empty, cavernous eyes. My stomach twisted. The voice whispered again. A gift should always be accepted. And then, the reflection blinked. The second it did, my vision went black. Not darkness, nothingness. I felt like I had been yanked out of my body, pulled through something hollow and endless. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. I felt weightless, trapped, like I was floating in some endless abyss. Then, I hit something hard. My breath returned in a shuddering gasp, my chest heaving. I wasn't in the petal-covered room anymore. I was back. I was home, lying on my bedroom floor. I gasped, pushing myself up, my heart still hammering against my ribs. It was morning again. The house was silent. For a long, painful moment, I sat there, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? But then I looked down at my hands, and the mirror was still there. I stared at it. The glass was no longer cracked. It was perfectly smooth, perfectly clear. Too clear. I swallowed hard. Slowly, hesitantly, I lifted it just enough to glimpse my reflection, and my stomach plummeted. Because this time, my reflection wasn't smiling. I watched it, waiting, like it knew something I didn't, like it was alive. And in its hand, it held a note, the same handwriting, the same ink, and I already knew what it would say before I even read it. Next time, don't accept the gift. The mirror sat too still in my shaking hands. My reflection was watching me. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't my own movements mirrored back at me. It was alive, waiting. The note it held in the glass was real. I could see the words. Next time, don't accept the gift. My stomach twisted violently. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to know. I dropped the mirror. The second it hit the ground, the lights in my house flickered. My breath hitched. Every hair on my body stood on end. The air had shifted. It felt heavier, now denser. The house around me no longer felt safe. Something had changed. I reached for my phone with numb fingers, my mind screaming at me to call someone, anyone. But when I picked it up, the screen was black. Not off, not dead, just empty. Like the device itself had been wiped clean. Like it had never even been a phone to begin with. My heartbeat pounded violently in my ears. Then, another note appeared, sliding out from beneath my door slowly. I hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, I picked it up. I already knew what it would say before I even unfolded it. You should have followed the rules. My fingers trembled as I turned the note over. There were new words scrawled underneath. A list. More rules. Number 1. If you hear footsteps, do not turn around. Number 2. If the lights go out, do not move. Number 3. If the phone rings, do not answer. Number 4. If you see something in the mirror, do not acknowledge it. Number 5. If the door knocks, do not open it. Number 6. At 3:33 a.m., hide. My chest tightened. I didn't know what these meant, but I knew one thing for certain. The game wasn't over. I had broken a rule somewhere along the way, and now, it wasn't playing fair anymore. The second I finished reading, I heard it. Slow, deliberate, not outside, inside. My blood froze. The first rule flashed through my mind. Number 1. If you hear footsteps, do not turn around. I was standing in my bedroom, the door wide open. The footsteps weren't coming from outside. They were coming down the hallway, toward me. I clenched my jaw. I wanted to turn. I needed to turn, but I knew I couldn't. If I turned around, I would see it. And if I saw it, it would see me too. The footsteps grew closer, slower. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The footsteps stopped right behind me, breathing, deep, slow. Something was standing inches from my back. I felt it, felt the weight of its presence, pressing into my skin. And then, it spoke. Turn around. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. And then, the lights in the house went out. Everything around me plunged into suffocating blackness. The second rule flashed through my mind. Number 2. If the lights go out, do not move. I still went, so still that my muscles burned from the tension. The breathing behind me stopped. But I knew better. I knew it was still there, waiting, watching, testing me. I squeezed my hands into fists. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then, the lights flickered back on. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. I hadn't moved. I passed. But I didn't have time to celebrate, because the phone started ringing. My gaze snapped to my nightstand. The phone, the one that had been wiped clean, erased. It was ringing. The sound was sharp, shrill, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. My stomach twisted violently. Number 3. If the phone rings, do not answer. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay perfectly still. It rang again. And again. Each time the sound became worse, like something beneath the ringing was trying to push through. A voice. I could hear it now, whispering, calling my name. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out. But I could still hear it. Pick up. The whisper was right next to my ear. I squeezed my eyes shut. The ringing stopped. Silence. I let out a slow, shuddering breath. And then, the mirror moved. A soft scraping sound filled the room, like glass against wood. I didn't want to look. I shouldn't look. 4. If you see something in the mirror, do not acknowledge it. But I already knew. Something was in the mirror, watching me, waiting. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The mirror shifted again. The sound was unbearable, like nails scraping against glass, like something inside was trying to get out. Then, the whispering started again, but this time, It was my own voice. You already broke the rules. Why stop now? I shut my eyes, my nails digging into my palms. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. And then, the knock came. Knock, knock. My entire body locked up. 5. If the door knocks, do not open it. It was waiting for me to break. Waiting for me to mess up. I gritted my teeth. I wouldn't open it. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder and louder until it wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding. And then, the clock struck 3:33 a.m. The final rule. 6. At 3:33 a.m., hide. My breath hitched. The knocking stopped. And then, something clicked. A sound that made my stomach drop. The door had unlocked. And then it opened. By itself. I was walking in circles. I didn't notice at first too, caught up in the fear, in the way the petals twitched beneath my feet, in the whispers that slithered through the trees like a voice I was never meant to hear. But now I saw it. I passed the same tree, the same twisted, gnarled bark, the same note, crushed beneath the weight of my own footprints. But they weren't my footprints anymore. The indentations in the dirt were too large, too deep. I wasn't just walking in circles. Something else was walking with me. My breath came in shallow gasps. I could feel the air shifting, growing thicker, tighter, like the forest itself was pushing inward, sealing me inside. I bent down, hands shaking as I reached for the note. It wasn't the same one I had seen before. This time the words were different. You were never meant to follow. My stomach twisted violently. My hands shook. And then, a whisper, right against my ear, so close I could feel the breath on my skin. But you did. I turned, too fast, too panicked, and I saw them. The footprints were still forming, one by one, right behind me. But I wasn't moving. I wasn't even breathing. Something was walking toward me, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, just the petals, just the endless, suffocating dark. I took a slow step backward. The footprints took a step forward. I choked on a breath, then another step. The footprints matched me, perfectly, as if something I couldn't see was mirroring my every move. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But then, another note fluttered to the ground. It landed between the footprints, between me and it. My stomach clenched as I bent down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The ink was wet, like the words had just been written. Do not turn around again. My heart stopped. I hadn't turned around just once. I had done it twice. The note crumpled in my fist. I messed up. I messed up. I messed up. A deep, shuddering breath rasped through the air, right behind me. Closer now. Too close. The forest held its breath. No more wind. No more shifting leaves. Only the slow, deliberate sound of something exhaling. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body locking up. I wouldn't turn around. I couldn't. I wouldn't. Then, a voice. Soft, familiar, and wrong. You should have read the first rule more carefully. I went ice cold, because the voice wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from inside me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, but my lips were still moving, still whispering. You should have never followed. My own voice, speaking words I wasn't saying. The footprints in front of me began to change. They weren't indentations anymore. They were legs, rising, stretching, forming into something tall, something thin, something smiling. And when I finally forced myself to move to run, to get away, the trees had already closed in. There was no way out. I don't remember what happened next. I don't know how long I was in that forest, how many times I ran, how many rules I broke without realizing. All I know is that I woke up back home, on the floor, in the dark. My breath is shallow. My limbs are numb. The house was silent. Too silent. I forced myself up, my body aching like I had been dragged. Then I saw it. The mirror, right in front of me, perfectly intact. And in the glass, I wasn't alone. I didn't even have time to scream, because the reflection moved first. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I ever left that forest. But if you see rose petals outside your door, don't follow them. Don't read the notes. And above all, don't break the rules. Because if you do, you might not make it back. Or worse, you'll think you made it back, but something else will come with you. If you felt a chill while reading this, if you heard something behind you, If you felt like you weren't alone, it's already watching you. Would you have broken the rules? Or are you already part of the game? If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality.